He wants you to succeed. Have faith of a mustard seed. Get up on your feet. Rise up.
Welcome to another segment of the Drexel Seymour Show. And today, my guest is not a stranger to the Drexel Seymour Show. He's been on the show before in a different capacity. But today is Professor Gilbert Morris. And we'll be talking a variety of subjects, and which I think is necessary because not only talking about it, we're going to be suggesting recommendations and plans on how we get solve some of these issues that we face in the Turks and Caicos. And of course, it could be applicable to other countries as well. And with that said, I want to welcome Professor Gilbert Morris to the Drexel Seymour Show again. Welcome to the show.
It's good to see you, my brother. How are you doing?
Good. How are things with you?
Excellent. Too much travel, but we can't complain about those things.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I know since the last time you were in the show, you've been given some promotion in the Bahamas. What is that all about?
Well, the government, in their, some people may say their lack of wisdom, appointed me ambassador at large, and with the title National Public Reader. So the National Public Reader is when you study in the ancient system, you are a tutor, a lecturer, then a fellow, then a reader, then a professor. So the Bahamas has this, and all the Commonwealth countries actually have it. Nobody's ever used it. Mm-hmm. And so I am the National Public Reader, and the National Public Reader is supposed to lead the country in discussion in moments of crisis or about things which could become crisis level. So I'm the National Public Reader with the title of Ambassador at Large, but I'm also the Vice Chancellor of the Bahamas Alray Ramsey Institute for Foreign Affairs. So I teach all of the young diplomats in the Bahamas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Now, I want to talk about us coming together as individuals. That's the first area I want to talk about. And a group of us have formed a company. We have formed a company called Turks and Caicos United Investment.
Yes.
And I remember when you and I met after the conference, I think that was held, the Economic Empowerment Conference,
Yes,
I think in
absolutely,
2019.
Yes.
After the conference, we decided, let's put something together, but it never materialized.
Right.
But this is materializing.
Right.
The company's incorporated, it's formed. We have a board, we have different committees,
Right.
and we're asking people to, invest $1,000
Right.
or more, but the minimum is $1,000 a share.
Right.
What are your thoughts about more people coming together and then investing in the country?
Well, there's some context, isn't there? You remember at that conference, I was the keynote speaker. And during my presentation, I asked everybody to put in $1, and we collected $117. So you do have an anchor. You must speak to Ms. Tremaine Swan,
yes,
Harvey, and she would have the accounting of that. So that can be a contribution, an omnibus contribution from that conference. And in speaking with you, I believe I had suggested that the stimulus which people have received, that there's an idea that they would pledge their stimulus to this institution as a way of building. You see, in the Caribbean, Turks and Caicos, Bahamas, in Africa, we've had these community-based organizations called ASU.
Oh, yeah.
Where people have circled the money around in the community. Now we have to do it more institutionally, because ASU is for consumerism largely. People get chunks of money, they add a piece onto their house, a child goes to school, whatever it is, and you keep contributing around in the circle. Here we have to be a little bit more strategic and see if we can't build up a credit system, a local credit system. And in South Africa, this ASU is called Kegel. And since 1994, 3 Kegels in South Africa have become banks.
Oh, really?
Yes. So 3 ASU groups got large enough to become banks. And all 3 of those banks are now valued at over $1 billion each.
Wow, that's amazing.
Run by women, mostly women, right? And so it can be done, and it can be mathematized. So we know that if 300 people put in 1,000, we know what that is, 300,000. If 300 people put in 2,000, we know what that is, and so on and so on and so on. And of course, one of the things that we have in the Caribbean is companies always have loan books where they lend money to employees. So if companies would say, okay, we're going to stop the lending, and everything that we would lend in a year, we'll just give to the institution and you lend it because you have banking knowledge and experience. And now that adds another, line of cash that can be loaned in the community. And then nothing hurts to go to the government and say, we've raised this amount of money. Companies have put this amount of money. Now you match what has been done. And then the thing kickstarts. And all of a sudden, you see, because you have InvestTC, right? You have National Insurance. Why should both of them be bad versions of Scotiabank, where you just have to go through the same rigmarole as you would go through? Why don't they simply give the money that they're going to lend to this institution? So you have one national institution that can really put a dent in the need for
well, InvestTCI doesn't lend money. They just give grants.
Yes. When I was chairman, we had a system where we thought what we would do is set up a REIT. When I was chairman, when it was called TC Invest, I was the last chairman under that name. And the idea would be to set up a real estate investment trust and then raise money and lend money from there. But what I'm saying is, years ago, I had recommended that instead of just the grants, that if National Insurance, why have 2 sets of loan administrations? Just have National Insurance pledge a certain amount of money to InvestTC. Now, have them both run that under one institution. You have the institutional knowledge will be aggregated together in such a small community. You don't need 5 different centers of this money. And they can sit on the board and monitor how things go along. And you create a real institution, such as they did in Bangladesh with Grameen Bank, which was where they won the Nobel Prize for being a micro-lending institution.
Well, I mean, thanks for that. I mean, we're going to progress.
Yes.
And that was the whole idea, too, with the stimulus. We threw it out there, the $1,000 stimulus.
Right.
Use that and invest.
Yes.
And together we'll invest in real estate and other industries.
Yes.
In Turks and Caicos.
Yes.
And I think it's going to go well.
Well, there are a couple of things. Turks and Caicos is high end, largely because we have incredibly tight economies of scale. So the amortization period for any investment has to be shortened. And that's part of the rationale for owned villas as part of the hotel pool. But for Turks and Caicos Islanders, we aren't going anywhere. We don't need a short amortization period. So there's no reason why an institution like this shouldn't invest in EP hotels, right? An EP hotel owned by the people of Turks and Caicos.
That's the plan.
I always believe that we should have a big Marriott or something like that that's owned by the people of Turks and Caicos. And it can double as a training center for people learning management and all those kinds of things. Kind of like the way that the straw market and the fish fry used to be in the Bahamas, where you were meant only to be in it for 3 years, then to go off and build your own thing. It was meant to be an incubator to get you turned around and so on. So yes, so there's a lot of things which can be done, which are highly profitable. You can mathematize it very clearly and project what the income is going to be and know beforehand whether it's a good investment or not.
Right, right. So what are your thoughts? I know there's a lot of talk recently by a few people talking about the Turks and Caicos Islands becoming an independent nation.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, every citizen of his or her country should want independence. I mean, you want to determine your own affairs in the world and that sort of thing. No question about it. But I work on the numbers, on the structure of things. That's my job, is to come in and people say, how will this work? Can you build out a mathematical case or a strategic case for this? When the independence movements began, it was largely Roosevelt who insisted to Churchill after the Second World War, get rid of the colonies. And Roosevelt appointed a black man named Ralph Bunche, Dr. Ralph Bunche, who developed something called the mandate system. So the mandate was, according to this mandate, you will manage your territories or your colonies towards independence. Turks and Caicos was part of that, right? Ralph Bunche did. The countries that became independent also as part of a movement, right? A global movement towards independence. And then those that remained were considered too small to fend for themselves. But under the Committee of 24 at the United Nations, which is the committee that manages the mandate system, Palestine was under the same mandate system. The language is that all those who had colonies, which were too small at the time for independence, for self-determination, that they had the obligation to manage those territories towards independence. So while the British have dominion over Turks and Caicos Islanders are supposed to have a measuring rod. And every year we should have a set of markers and say, this gets us closer and closer and closer to independence.
But that's not happening.
Now, we haven't done that.
No.
And neither have they.
Yeah.
Right? So the first thing would be, obviously we all want independence. That's not an issue to talk about. The issue to talk about is, what is the criteria? And you can't say, we just have the right to independence, because there's the reality of the world, right? We don't have a lender of last resort in Turks and Caicos. We have US currency, as we've dollarized. Mr. Trump is doing something called the Mar-a-Lago Accords. Have you heard of it?
No, I haven't heard of it.
Mar-a-Lago Accords is to depreciate the dollar, right? So that it could increase the viability of US manufacturers. When you dollarize, these are issues you have to be aware of.
Yeah, of course.
Because they change, to some degree, your purchasing power in the world. And if you have debt instruments and so on, they can change the coordinates for those debt instruments. So again, independence, the fact that we deserve or we want, that's not a question. You waste no time talking about that. The question is, what is the criteria? And in the Committee of 24, under the mandate system at the United Nations, there is a criteria. So we should get that criteria and then lay out the things you need. You need institutional integrity, institutions that are strong enough to withstand. Why would we become independent, for instance, if we don't have a judicial system that can stand on its own? Because in the separation of powers under any constitution, you have to have a judicial system that can stand on its own, because the judicial system has to hold the executive and the legislature, to the degree that they make legislation, has to ensure that it complies with the Constitution. And in our system, in all systems in the world, but certainly in ours, right, the Constitution is superior to any elected member of government, because the elected members of government are creatures of the Constitution.
Right, indeed.
Right. So we don't have parliamentary sovereignty. This was an argument in the Bahamas, and I had to make the case that no. How can you have parliamentary sovereignty when Article 2 of the Constitution makes it very clear the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and any law is null and void to the extent that it contradicts or contravenes the Constitution. So knowing, when you say independence, we have to be aware of what we mean by parliamentary sovereignty, by constitutional sovereignty. And then constitutional sovereignty has many little rules in it that you have to set in place, right? So judicial independence, security of tenure. Do we have a judicial system at the moment that could withstand that? How do you fund the judiciary? Because that's one way the executive can get control of the judiciary, because of the funding propositions. So again, no issue about whether we should become independent, but and no issue about whether we should want to become independent. The question is, what's the roadmap, right? What's the roadmap? And finally, when being sovereign means you have to have certain responsibilities. So for instance, if we want to develop, and if we have developed, a ship's registry, a ship runs aground, kills a bunch of people in the Malacca Straits near Malaysia or Singapore, and we are the registry. What do we do? God forbid, a jumbo jet meets with misfortune in Turks and Caicos. What do we do? If Hurricane Dorian that hit Freeport and destroyed Freeport and Abaco, and we're independent, hits Provo and sits over Provo for 4 days, right? With 120, 140 mile an hour winds. Where do we, if we're independent, where do we go? We have to build up a reserve of close to $1 billion. We have to build up financial systems. We have to build up some sort of basket of currencies so that we can protect ourselves and so on. As a sovereign state, what's going to be our initial contribution to the special drawing rights of the IMF, which is a fund that every country that's a member of the IMF keeps at the IMF, that's transferable to all currencies in the world, or all instruments of value. So that should be close to $500 million. Why? Because why step out? We've seen what's happened to everybody else. Why step out without being prepared? We have to be prepared to meet our obligations in the world. You'd have to develop a foreign policy. The Bahamas has decided that it wants representation in every country in the world. Well, that requires preparation. You have to decide. We want 10 to 15, 20 full embassies in 20 countries, half embassies in 15 countries, and digital embassies and all the rest. You have to plan that, right? As a sovereign nation. Why would you be doing that? Because you see that your opportunity in the world is becoming the back channel where you get along with everybody, so people who don't get along with each other have to use you. Oman has done that. It has become very significant in the world in that respect. So the independence question is one that requires, it's almost like you have to develop a national development plan to ensure that you can protect the country and that it can move forward on these institutional bases. And the cost of that is very, very high. There are things that we don't pay for at the moment that are being done to protect us, that we don't cover ourselves. Cost of that is very, very high.
So it's a big financial impact then.
Absolutely. Otherwise, one finds oneself in a critical, Turks and Caicos is about 15,000 souls. There are more Turks and Caicos Islanders in Freeport than there are Turks and Caicos Islanders in Turks and Caicos.
Yeah, that's true.
And sometimes I tease and say we're 7 families pretending to be a country, right? But Turks and Caicos Islands has put itself on the map in the most beautiful way across the world in the last 35 years or so. So now we have to map out this future that we want, and we have all these talented, intelligent people with great experience and so on. We have to bring all of them to the table and make it a collective thing where we map out this idea of what we want to be. You have to choose how we want to be in the world. You take someplace like Cayman. During COVID, Cayman decided that, okay, we can't just be tourism and financial services. We need to be health, tourism, and financial services. Cayman is 65,000 people with a $5.5 billion GDP. Barbados is 280,000 people with a $5.2 billion GDP. So if you see what Cayman has done for itself compared to a much bigger Barbados, the share of GDP, so productivity as a share of GDP in Cayman, is maximized well and above that of Barbados, probably by 4 or 5 times, you see? So a country has to decide, where is it that we want to hit? At what level? What sort of country do we want to be? What kind of infrastructure will we have? What will we be known for? You know, what will be what Maurice Clinton, who was born in South Caicos, the distinguished barrister in the Bahamas, says, what is our original ethic? What will we be known for? So Canada wants to be known as the human rights superpower of the world. That's what they said that, right? Switzerland wants to be known as neutral. Singapore is responsible with 3 other countries, jurisdictions, for $80 trillion of currency, Forex trading around the world to create 24 hours. So it starts in Frankfurt, goes to London, goes to New York, then goes to Singapore, then goes back to Frankfurt. So Singapore is part of that 4-country cycle. They made that for themselves, and then they built their foreign policy out of punching above their weight with the big boys at the big table.
It's interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Of course, thank you for that. So we talk about independence now. Let's talk about your point of view from a crime point of view. You know, we continue.
Yes.
Of course, the Bahamas, same issue. We continue to face, the world.
Yes.
Continue to face so much crime taking place, serious crime, such as murders, and even trying to, solve these issues. The Commissioner of Police, I know, recently has stated that they've been able to, charge and find individuals who were involved in the last 3 that we had. What do you think the answers are?
Let me speak philosophically.
Yeah.
Now, I teach and have taught political science, jurisprudence, these kinds of things. And I'm an economist, so I've had a lot of experience looking at this. My conclusion is this. Theoretically, governments can't solve crime problems. They also can't fix education.
Okay.
Rich, prosperous parents demand good education. Look at the countries around the world where you have excellent education. They have a big middle class. And the middle class is very competitive. So parents put pressure on the schools to deliver for the children. So the government is just following what the parents want in those situations. Crime is a cantilever. If, this is speaking theoretically now, on incentives, if it is easier to commit crimes than to be a good, upstanding citizen, then crime will rise. If the penalty for committing crimes is immediate and high, but the option for becoming a good citizen is low, you'll have a better society. So if you look at Singapore, what did they do? In 1962, fresh from the Japanese invasion, Britain put them out on their own. If you look at Malaysia, the SIA in Malaysia is for Singapore, the Singapore-Malay unification. That's where that comes from.
Is that right?
The SIA in Malaysia is for Singapore.
Okay.
Because they were a union.
Yeah.
Right? Malaysia kicked Singapore out of the union. Say, y'all just some little wastrel.
Yeah.
Y'all from
not
north,
significant.
Yeah, y'all from north of the buoy. We ain't want nothing to do with y'all. Right? And so on. So Singapore's on its own. Malcolm X says, if you want to change a culture, you first need an act of integrity. So, and then everything gets built on that integrity. So like Maurice Clinton said, the original ethic, right? The US tried to bribe a Singapore policeman, high-ranking policeman. He reported it. Lee Kuan Yew, then being the astute fellow that he was, Prime Minister of Singapore, used it to embarrass the Americans. And they said, well, you know, we'll give you some money. He goes, no, you won't give me any money. Singapore needs military training. So they provided a certain, I think it was $32 million as penalty for trying to bribe this person to sort of keep it quiet and so on. Of course, 20 years later, Lee Kuan Yew still talked about it publicly. Yeah, absolutely. And so because they weren't open to bribes, the US then had to make a contribution. And I think I have this right, that Lee Kuan Yew went to Harvard University and asked them to develop a program for the training of civil servants. And then he sent Singapore civil servants to that program because he thought that would link them with senior civil servants from around the world who were doing the program. That's one. Number two, he had this problem that the proximity of Indonesia and Malaysia, he had a Malaysian chief of police and an Indonesian chief of the military, and Malaysia and Indonesia kept threatening to invade Singapore. So here he is driving home every night. He got a Indonesian-dominated military and a Malaysian-dominated police force, and he's carrying a pistol in his pocket in his official car in case his driver kidnaps him. Right. That's how treacherous it was. From that act of integrity of not taking the bribes, they got the money to put together a Singapore cadet corps and militia. And everyone from high school had to serve in that militia. Now, why is that important? Because you had Chinese who dominated the economy, Singapore. He was ethnic Chinese, ethnic Han, right, who dominates China itself. So Xi Jinping, all those Han, right? And he had Malay, Indonesian, Bangladeshi, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, all living in a hodgepodge together. So in order to create a unified Singapore, he used the military. So you went to...
Which consists of different...
all these different people. Yeah. So you go to high school, in the last year of high school, you have to get into the cadet corps, and you serve 2 years in the military. And what happens in the military? You learn the same songs, you learn the same history, you learn the same background, you learn the same respect for the rule of law, you develop relationships that you're going to have for the rest of your life. You learn how, like in the US military among captains train captains. So you can't pull rank. They actually have to respect you for you to be chosen as the leader, right? So Singapore implemented all of these protocols, and that unified and galvanized a country that was made up of a hodgepodge of people. Now, are we not in a similar state?
Yeah.
So if every child has to go to serve, I see the advertisements for the militia, but in this case, they're not calling for you to join. That's mandated. You have to join. Every child. So you're in the militia. You're learning the same history, learning the same social theory about who we are. That's why you have to have a plan for what the country is going to be, because you teach it to these young people. Singapore went so far. They were famous for warehousing when they first started in 1962, because it was a port area. They didn't have the money to do shipping, so they said, let's go into warehousing. When they went into warehousing, they had to become experts in making cardboard boxes to store all the things in the warehouse. They used the cardboard boxes to make textbooks. They taught the children in school about warehousing and cardboard making, as part of their, practical
Curriculum.
studies, so that they could ensure that as people graduated, they could go right into the main business of the country
Right.
and make it work. So
That
you
makes
see,
sense.
a plan that makes sense for the world,
Yeah,
not
that makes sense.
not some theory about what you want to do. I do this all the time when I go to countries. I've advised in 33 countries. Invariably, the leader of the country comes and tells you, and they bring the manifesto that they have. And I go, no, not the manifesto. Bring me a map. When I look at the map, I can tell you what this country can and cannot do, right? If you look at Turks and Caicos on the map, and you look at Provo, and you look at the port issues, you're just not going to be a, distribution center, a high-end port, because you got the reef 13 miles out to sea. The cut in the reef is 13 feet deep. On the inside is 9, 11 feet deep, and so on. And you got a short quayside. So that can't be a transshipment. Maybe you can do it in other places like South Caicos or West Caicos, but it can't be done in Provo. So the map tells you what your capacity is, right? I did a study for Madame Wu when she was vice premier of China in 2003. Showed that $178 billion worth of goods came to the Panama Canal, went up to the port of New Jersey, because it can't stop anywhere in the Caribbean. There's no break bulk facility.
Okay.
So it goes right through the Caribbean, up to the port of New Jersey, but $19 billion worth of that goods is for the Caribbean. So it has to be trucked down to Florida, and then we go over, buy it, and we pay double freight, right?
That passes
because we export air, right? We pay double freight. So looking at the map tells you need to find a spot in the Caribbean to do break bulk. Because if you did that, that would be a way of reducing the cost of trade. So it's not somebody's opinion. It's not someone theorizing. The map tells you what the capacity is.
Interesting.
So what am I saying here? This knowledge that we're talking about, this is the knowledge the young people learn in the Cadet Corps. They feel connected to the society. They feel responsible for the society. They know what injures the society. They know what advances the society. If you meet a Swiss child and you say, oh, you all are in banking, that's really great. Now, the Swiss are known for banking, but that child would correct you and say, no, we are masters at engineering. But we made these big vaults that couldn't move. So they brought the money to us where the vaults were, and that's how we got into banking. But we are engineers.
Yeah.
In fact, we like Switzerland so much, we built it twice. There's a Switzerland that you see, and then there's a Switzerland that's inside the Alps.
Okay.
Where almost 70% of the population can recede into the mountains if there is a crisis in Switzerland. So there are two Switzerlands. They built two, and both of them work better than most countries in the world.
Interesting.
So again, you know what you are.
Yeah.
The map tells you what your capacity can be. And so when you want to solve crime, this is why I say, look at how many components I've named there.
Yep.
It has to be an all-in, an all-of-society program. You can't just hire policemen and say, listen, don't come back here without those criminals, mash them up, you know what I mean? And it doesn't work that way. Because human beings are expansive and they're constantly doing things. I'll give you one last example. El Salvador had the worst crime in the world, world murder capital, right? Murder capital of the world, 3.5 years ago, right? Bukele comes to power, the president. He arrests 75,000 people. He takes the money in the budget, goes around to all the vacant buildings and so on, re-engineers them as prisons, and he arrests 75,000 people in a country of just a little over 6 million. 65 murders a day in broad daylight, right? That's the situation. But you know what he said? For these 75,000 criminals, there has to be 1 million people facilitating them. The auntie in this office, the cousin at the port, the friend at the airport, and so on. So they identified all of them. We know what you're doing. All right? We've decided not to arrest you, but don't think we don't know. So if you see crime operating on the landscape, what you're seeing is only the tip of the iceberg. The facilitation, the infrastructure that facilitates the crime is much, much larger. And it involves people that we know and love.
Yeah.
Right? Inescapable.
Yeah.
I was telling someone in the Bahamas, she was saying to me about crime. And I said, well, we're all corrupt. So she says, I'm not corrupt. But she was telling me a day before about how she had applied for an advance, the expedited passport because her child had to go to school. And that when she got there, it wasn't ready. So she was yelling and then someone whispered to her and said, listen, I got the hookup. Come this way. And they called somebody and they called someone, and then it got solved. Of course, I'm sure there's some lunch money.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Yes, okay. That's corruption.
Yeah.
Now, is it her fault? Yes and no. She responded to it. It was a desperate situation. And when your child is involved and they got to go back to school and all that, the last thing you want to do is drive home where the child is supposed to be on a plane, right? But all delay is corruption. All delay. When you have a government service that does not meet the citizen's need,
that's interesting.
That itself is corruption. Because that creates the incentive to go around the system and
sort of enable it. Yeah.
Absolutely. It enables the system to accommodate corruption.
That's
and I always found it interesting that in these small countries we have, it takes longer to get things done than India with 1.4 billion people. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, in 2016, in 11 months, got 1.2 billion people on digital ID, created 680 million new bank accounts in 11 months, 1.2 billion people. Little small countries like this, Jamaica, it's taken Jamaica 7 years to get its digital ID program going. The reason is Narendra Modi, again, you have to have this ideal of who you are and what you want to be. And Narendra Modi said, Indians have nothing. I cannot go to them and pass a law demanding that they give over their ID when they have nothing. I have to give them something and say, your digital ID is the pathway to these things. So they set up a seed bank where farmers could get seeds.
Oh, okay.
They set up, again, bank accounts where you could get, they set up a micro loan program where you could use you can't get the loan unless you have the EID and so on. So it's not the government saying, I'm in charge, this is where we want to go, sign up for this EID or else. It's the government saying, the country belongs to you, and you have a right to benefit from it. This is a pathway to make your citizenship more valuable. And that's what they did for 1.2 billion people in 11 months. That means that if you take Berkeley in El Salvador, now El Salvador is rated as the safest country in the world. Safest country in the world. Paid off their national debt in 3.5 years. So you have to say, if they could do that in 3.5 years, change completely from the last to the first, right? Why can't we change our situation? What is it about the crime in our situation that makes it so impossible for us to get to the bottom of it? Is it because we're so small that it involves arresting people who are family members and people we love and don't want to injure? Is it because the networks that are involve people who are part of the constabulary, meaning that, one of the things that we found across the Caribbean when you've done these investigations is that, and I'm not impugning I'm not trying to color the police force or the constabulary, but one of the things that was found is when crime is persistent, is because the police are part of the problem.
Yeah.
That has been the case. So one has to, and that means that you have to do what Singapore did, right?
Let them know you know.
Yes, you have to let them know that you know. You have to be very serious. So if you take Singapore, you take El Salvador, right? And you look at what they've done, and then you say to yourself, I don't have the excuse that Singapore is different from us culturally, therefore, because you can't get more different in chalk and cheese than El Salvador and Singapore. And people have said to me, you shouldn't compare countries. And I go, no. Comparison comes in two ways in sociology. You could compare for substance and analogy, and then you can compare for principles. If your what's your brother's name? You have a brother?
Yeah, Dudley.
Okay. Mm-hmm. When your mother says, be more like Drex, she doesn't mean become Drex. Mm. She means the intangibles. Be on time, keep your word, be respectful. And so in this way, you could compare any country with any country.
True. Good point.
Because you're comparing on the principles.
Yeah, the attributes.
Not on the substance.
Yeah.
You see? So when we compare Singapore with Turkey, we're not, they have 2.6 million people. We're not making that comparison. We're saying they're diligent.
Yeah.
They follow through. They have accountability systems and so on. So in Singapore, when they have a cabinet meeting, every cabinet member has a desk with a monitor in it. Mm-hmm. All the legislation is right in that monitor. The prime minister can see every document in every ministry in the government, where it's supposed to go. Mm-hmm. When they go to parliament, every parliamentary person sitting there, and inside their machine is the piece of legislation. Mm-hmm. If you want to make a change, they don't, you watch Singapore parliament, you can't just row. You can't do that. Mm-hmm. I can't just say, Drexel just want to make him and his friends rich. No, that's libel, you go into jail. No, you can't do that. In Singapore's parliament, I can say the minister has proposed a road policy, but I think it's about 25% too expensive. Here are two alternatives then the minister has to get up and say, we check those alternatives. If you look at your monitor, I put the documents in there for you to see that shows why, because those two companies didn't deliver on their last three projects, and therefore we thought it's safer to go, even though the price was. Okay. So there's a rationale.
Right.
So you're not wasting time saying, they down from, in that corner, and his ma wasn't no good, and his pa was no good, and he no good, right? So you don't get that privilege, right? Because what you look at in many of these Caribbean parliaments is people wasting time, rowing each other and so on. People's business is gone.
Still, it remains untouched.
Untouched.
Yeah.
And so in the Singapore case, you can go to any government ministry and you can ask for your document. And there's a big flat screen that shows where your document is and what's happening to it.
The status.
Right? So no delay. Delay and confusion is corruption.
Corruption. That's interesting.
Right? So getting at crime requires us to do that. Last point on the crime thing. When Nigel Dakan was here as governor, I wrote to him and said, I will volunteer to be police commissioner.
Oh, really?
Yes. And he said to me, what do you know about policing? I say about the same amount as your police commissioner, obviously. Right? So I'm sorry if he's still around or whatever it is, but the crime was exploding, right? And I said, well, at least I know the people. And I'm from Wheeling, so we have an inherent bossiness that means that we are going to get about the place and make things happen. But the point I was trying to make to him was, I'll give you now again. I've advised, countries with big issues in policing, big issues in military, big issues. Let me tell you something so for instance, at George Mason University, we have the most advanced in Fairfax County first responders in the United States. The number one first responders, the one that trains all the other first responders, is at George Mason University, the Fairfax first responders. It's held in the fire department in Fairfax County. And we have the disaster simulation at George Mason University. And I've run 4 of those disaster simulations. So imagine a nuclear bomb hits Washington, D.C. You're in charge. What do you do? I've run those simulations. Now, let me give you an example. If we were to go to the police commissioner, that police commissioner at the time, I don't want to involve anyone in intrigue, and say, what's your theory of the crime? Like, how does crime happen in Turks and Caicos? What is its origin? Where does it come from? What's stimulating it? What is it attached to that feeds it? Can you explain? Don't tell me that there are murderers and maybe the crime happens from something that's not a crime, right? You have to be able to point to the points of origin and the thing that sustains it. Because in your attacking of any sort of social event, any sort of social, you have to be able to go to the spots where it sprouts from and be able to close those off, right? Now, the lazy thing is, it's the immigration problem, right? But many of our children are involved, right? Many of our children. So it's not that simple. So even if you solve the problem, there are those people who are now, who've been 10 years in crime.
Yeah.
What do you do with them?
Yeah.
You need a workers program. You need something to retrain them and retool them. For young people, how do you steer them to something different? Well, that's your cadet corps, after school sports and activities and so on. That gives them some place to go so they have an alternative. It's easier to enter that than to enter crime.
Yeah.
If you're not doing that, you're not solving crime. So crime is not about the police. Last point, I said I was going to give you a last point.
That's
give you
right.
one last point.
Yeah.
Botswana, new prime minister. He comes to office. They have a plan, $26 million to build 15 new police stations and jails. He cancels the program, right? And he says, no, put that in after-school programs, put that in hiring coaches, put that in building basketball courts, tennis courts, and things of that sort, and let us embrace our young people rather than set up a sort of endpoint for them to end up. We're going to police the society. They're going to end up here. Let's invest preventatively at the front end so that we don't have to spend that money on back-end solutions, right? Because the danger for small and inexperienced countries is they put infrastructure on the results. And then you're basically saying, well, this is going to continue. So if we invest in a rebar factory to build bars for houses, security bars, what we're really saying is we're not going to fix the crime problem. So we're going to fix the result, and every house, every building, every window, every door is just going to have rebar or security.
Crime still will happen.
Crime still would happen because you're investing in the solution of the status quo. You're not trying to counteract the problem.
We're basically saying crime is happening.
Absolutely. So you say, listen, you have to accept it. And I've heard people say that. Oh, no, Morris, you have to accept Turks and Caicos has grown. Crime's going to happen. It doesn't happen in Monaco. It doesn't happen in Singapore. In Singapore. It doesn't happen in New Zealand.
It doesn't happen in Cayman.
Norway is closing prisons.
Yeah.
Denmark is closing prisons. Why?
Yeah.
Because they have a strategy
Yeah.
that eliminates crime, because it's easier to do. When you have nothing to do in Denmark, you get a PhD. Because it's so easy to get one, because education is free, right? They involve you in research and those sorts of things. They involve you in sport and that sort of thing. So you have other things to do to gain your sense of, yourself in the most effective way.
Yeah.
So I know that's not a nice, neat little packaged way, but the nice, neat way is false and lazy. Crime is an all of society proposition.
Yeah.
And if you have a large amount of crime, you can either turn your country into a garrison country like El Salvador, or you can solve your problem the way Singapore, the way New Zealand, the way Denmark, Norway, Cayman, all these places have solved the problem by involving the entire society.
Yeah. That's a lot, but thank you very much. I think I have to have you again.
Yes.
For another session.
Yes.
I just want to thank you for this opportunity. We talk about the crime. We talk about global immigration. We talk about the investment. And I think this is a good show to encourage people about investing.
Yes.
Not just investing for real estate, investing in our young people.
Right.
To help, eradicate the problem that we have here.
Right.
Do you have any closing remarks you want to have? Obviously, I'm going to have you back for another session.
I got like 5 days of closing remarks.
No. But thank you so much for sharing this.
Yeah. Let me say this. Tiger Woods won 2 Masters, and he won the US Open, the Australian Open, all in one go. And then when he did that, he went to Butch Harmon, his trainer, and says, I need to change my swing. And Butch was like, are you out of your mind? You didn't only win the Masters, you won it with 57 strokes.
You won too.
I mean, you won it going away. And you know what Tiger said to him? I don't know what I'm doing. My body, my instincts are doing it. But when that falls away, I won't have any skill. I need to master the skill at this level.
Interesting.
So I can predict what I'm going to do.
Okay.
Turks and Caicos has the feel of a gold rush town where things are just happening. And so if you look at where the buildings are being built, how they're being set up, there's no, setback alignment. So people are just doing things everywhere you go. People are just building wherever it is. There's no landscaping. They just plunk everywhere, right? But then on the numbers, Turks and Caicos is doing very, very well. And we are. The problem with that is and this has happened again and again, happened in Freeport, even happened in Nassau between 1987 and 1993. Had 1,800 applications before various government agencies. A young lady was raped on a golf course on Paradise Island. Everything's gone. Grand Bahama was the hottest place you can't imagine. Everybody wanted to be there, just like Provo is now.
Yeah.
Poof. That can happen. When you're in the mix of things, you got to be like Tiger Woods. Cousin Derek Taylor kept the national patrimony together, right? And the next administration came in, and they had an idea that was consistent with the low economies of scale and the high cost of things. And they went for high end, which allowed us to afford to be able to live here. The same thing is happening in Exuma, a small island. Again, islands are finite. If you do anything on an island, it raises the cost. If you take beaches, when beaches is full, right? And now with Treasure Beach added to that, there are more people in beaches than there are people in the labor force in Turks and Caicos. And those people in beaches earn 5 times what the average Turks and Caicos Islander earns. So in the retail space, you can price for the guests and not the locals, because the guests' consumerism is sustainable.
Yeah.
I'm staying next door in a villa to a couple, and they were sending their man to the food store. They're here for 5 days with $1,000 to buy groceries. No Turks and Caicos Islander, no average Turks and Caicos can match that, right? So what do you have? As a natural consequence, not accusing any government of doing anything wrong, as a natural consequence of being high-end and having so many high-end units in a country like this, is that the retail prices, not only are they high because you have inputs that are very high, like water and utilities and all that sort of thing, but eventually what happens is the cost of living outpaces the wages of the ordinary citizen. Now, you can do a couple of things for that. You can do stimulus, but no government is going to be able to do enough stimulus to offset the difference in wage. But it's not only that, it's the anxiety. People thinking that they can't really provide for their families well. And that will create social destabilization, you see? So I have recommended, again, I've done a lot of work on sovereign funds. I did the original cabinet paper. I don't know if that's illegal, if I'm allowed to say that. But anyway, I did it on the Turks and Caicos sovereign fund. And I had recommended that we not put any money in it. So if you take 1,000 acres, you put it in the sovereign fund. You attach every Turks and Caicos Islander through their national insurance number. So they are the members, the owners of the fund, right? And then you say, all staff quarters will be on this, in this 1,000 acres. All warehouses and all storage facilities and things like that will be. You've just created a situation where those lease payments come to your ordinary citizens to offset their salaries.
That makes sense.
We talked about the EP, the investments of this group. So the EP Hotel is on this, in this 1,000 acres. So again, this is owned by the people of Turks and Caicos. You want to do an affordable housing development. You put it, so now you have a fund, you say, the wealthy Turks and Caicos Islander or the wealthy guest, the person who works here, owns a resort, you want to invest in the future of your workers? We're going to create a mortgage fund that we're going to qualify people. They're going to be able to borrow money, but you're going to be the guarantor so that we could get people in, because the average person is sort of 32 years old, maybe a single mother with 2 children and so on, can't qualify for the 30-year mortgage. So we need to do some financial engineering. But all of a sudden the country's working. So people say, well, where's this happened before? Singapore again.
Okay.
When Lee Kuan Yew took over, as I told you, it was a hodgepodge. So what did they do? The sovereign fund of Singapore, Temasek, owns 80% of all real estate in the country and 90% of all rental property in the country. So the average Singaporean, when they're walking around, because we had in 2007 an official mission to Singapore, which I led with Minister Floyd Hall, then as he was, and Deputy Premier. And we met the Deputy Premier and Prime Minister of Singapore, and he told us, we have 1 million people with work permits in Singapore. So the group, the Turks and Caicos group that was there was like, 1 million work? How do you deal with that? They said, oh, when you get a job in Singapore, your work permit meets you at the airport. You know, you get a job. We issue the work permit. They said, but you don't question. No. We enforce the law. None of our businesses would lie to us because they know what would happen to them. So we enforce the law. So we don't have to have a complicated work permit strategy. We need those workers, but guess what? Those workers lease their accommodations and their offices from the people of Singapore through the sovereign fund.
Yeah, I like it.
So the average Singaporean, you see how Americans tell military people, thank you for your service? The average Singaporean says to an expatriate worker, thank you so much for your contribution. Because the more expatriate workers you see, that's more money going to the sovereign fund.
Yeah, I like that.
You see my point? So they've turned the country into a same set of needs that we have, but they've turned it into a cash register for their circumstances. Now, Singapore doesn't give out money monthly or annually. What they do is, in every crisis, like 2008, COVID, the financial crisis, 9/11 crisis, they pay every salary. All through COVID, the sovereign fund paid everybody's salary. You see my point?
Yep.
And they eliminate your national insurance, our equivalent of NHIP, drawn from your salary, because there's enough money in the fund, and they reinvest that. And it's $1 trillion. They have $1 trillion in their fund. And we attended an event where the Sovereign Fund of Singapore owns more than 160 companies. 120 of them have a market cap of over $1 billion each.
Awesome.
Do you see my point?
Yeah.
So we have to ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing if we're not on the way to that kind of expansive development? So the key thing in Turks and Caicos, aside from fixing the crime, as we said, we have to turn this country into a machine for prosperity for the ordinary Turks and Caicos Islander. And I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yes.
A wealth of information. And thank you. I appreciate your time. You've been watching the Draxel Sima Show. You've been encouraged, and I hope you've been inspired. And I encourage all of you who are watching the show to invest with Turks and Caicos United Investment Company. I think this will be the start of something great here in the Turks and Caicos Islands. And I also want to thank Seascape Townhomes for allowing me to use one of their townhomes to do this recording. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Right.